Here we're looking at economic systems. We're looking at macro and saying, how do you run things? By what standard? What measure do we use? What criteria? In this case, we're raising the question of economic systems. How do things function economically? How well do they look at? And so, as it, macro breaks down methods, because it generally, everybody talks about spectrum. There's free market, and they'll put like free markets over here, and then communism, and then people say the book will say, and there's mixed, and it's a gradient, but it's not catching the edge of which things have run by the way they measure work. What's the philosophy behind them? She's it's I like Mancue and stuff like that, but he's trying to create a flexible gradient. So what are the 5 economic systems? How do they answer the questions? Now, the 3 questions in economic systems. Who gets the goodies? We make things. Remember that, go back to Soul. There is a limit, a scarcity. There is a limit of resource, a limit of goods produced. And, as I said many times, I always, dislike that, because then people think of a fixed pie, and if somebody's getting something, I'm not. Whereas, especially when we go into, market economies and free markets, remember the firm, the only way can make money is making somebody better off. So you have to make the pie bigger, better. We live immensely greater than our ancestors did 1,000 years ago. We are fabulously wealthier than they are. As a population, even the poorest country. A good point that Landez, the comments would be in the major comment section, says is he goes in 18, I believe it was 47, where the richest man in the world died from an infection, from a common infection. He was the richest man in the world, and there was nothing he could do. That kind of infection has been solved on the world for common people for over 100 years. Or almost 100 years, I should say. They were just developing it in the 1920s, just to give you an idea. So all of his wealth could not have saved him. The poorest person in the United States, the poorest person in the world, has that now. Can we save from that now? He's wealthy. So the question is, who gets the goods? Who's getting the goodies? What goods are produced? How are they produced? So who's getting whatever we're making? Who's getting them? What goods should we produce? What items should be made? How should the goods be made? How large is the government? And what is the government's philosophy towards the economy? What is the government supposed to be doing? How big is the government? And what things should the government be doing in the such? That's why, for example, when people say, Americans will say, Denmark is socialist. And the Danes will say, we're not socialist. The Americans say, we have a big, giant government. The Danes will say, yes, but the government doesn't run the economy. And we're going to get to that one here. So how big is the government? What is the government's philosophy? Because that's an intriguing one sometimes. Okay, now the 5 economic systems. Now, we get this slide, and we're going to go through this slide, and we're going to get the next ones. The next ones do a live explanation of each of the philosophical points of the government. Now, I get the theories on top. We get the new class. And I admit, the theories we're going to be working with most of the time, and there's more range in this, but I tend to stay with these two because they're the ones we'll be talking on. Will tend to be the new classicalists, who I met are in the market economy structure, and the neo-Keynesians, who are going to be a little more involved in government. Now, there is communism, but communism doesn't work. Communism is messed up in the head, which we'll comment about. In fact, there were times I beat on things like, for lack of a term, socialism or the green movement. Not a clean environment, totally different thing. The green movement. I'll rag on their love of communism. Okay, now, so in the free market, who gets it? In the free market, now, free market would be called classical theory, or sometimes we use the term libertarians. A better term would be, what's called the classical model. In a free market, which there are no free market countries. There's not been a free market country for over 100 years. I know the book will talk about things like the primitive economy or this economy, that economy. Um, when someone's primitive, they don't know what they're doing, or it may be a straight extractive. And a lot of times, primitive economies are more of a proto-socialist than anything else, because in most primitive economies, everything belongs to the state, the god king, or the ruler, the head of chief of the tribe, or whatever. Okay, now there is the free market. In the free market, who gets it? The individual. What is made? It's decided by the market. How is it made? Decided by the firm. In the market economy, the government steps in because we're asking the question of, you know, what things should be done. In other words, how should we do certain things? And so the government's coming in saying, I'm filling in potholes. So who gets it? In the market economy, the individual is still the primary thing. The government's the lesser item. The market is still the primary thing. The government's becoming lesser. So the government's stepping in. I always call this one the filling of potholes. And that's usually covered by the new classical model, which is, of the three models I'm listing up there, is the youngest of the three. In fact, in some ways, you could say socialism is the oldest of the three listed. Or communism, I should say. Communism is the oldest of the three listed, because that goes back to the 19th century. The new Keynesian, or the neo-Keynesian, I should say, was developed in the 1930s, or the 1920s through the 30s and 40s. The new classicist will be developed, has a theory, in the 70s. And each one comes about in the sense of trying to figure out what works. Okay, so let's look at these theories, you know, in detail. Again, the free market economy. Now, the man there is a man named Ludwig von Mises. He is a free market economist. And he points out rightfully, in the free market economy, there's food and bread for all. Mass starvation's never happened in the free market economy. Supply and demand run everything. Your society, your culture, it's all focused. Keep in mind, you still have your high culture, high tech, because you need those. But he's pointing out that the free market economy never has a shortage of resources or capacity or anything. That is a fully functional, well-working creature. And I know you said I'm using the term creature. Think of an economy almost as non-organic entity, like I said, to make government, but just how everything functions together. So he says running it through the marketplace the best way. Go through in a capitalist country. And it's funny because the term capitalist was created by the communist. The free marketeers did not create the capitalist term. The communists did, because they wanted to say rule by the rich people. It just became the adopted term. So they just said, I will own it. But in that society, there was bread and food for all. Mass starvation was rare because every person could go and say, I can make something, I can produce something, I can do something. In other words, I can make the pie bigger. And by making the pie bigger, I can meet the needs of the general population. Occasionally, when this has existed, I said there are no free market countries. The last one to exist was the United States. From inception to 1914, or you could say 1917, basically 1914, because you had the progressive era, you had people like Wilson coming along, and who wanted power. I mean, politicians wanting power is an immense temptation. And the size of government here is small, itsy bitsy, less than 5% of the economy. Now, the free market, going to gradient, going through this gradient here, you have the market economy, which market economy, the idea of the market economy tends to line up with the new classical theory. Now, keep in mind, the new classicalists and the neo-Keynesians are rational economists. They make different assumptions on how things work. They both try to seek to figure out how things work and how we make them better. The communist ideologues, they're like, weird, cultists. We put them over there. We mention them because a lot of people have way too much admiration and love of them. Communism is not simple. Let's go back to the market economists, the new classics. Basically, the private sector is doing anything. The government's going to be filling in potholes. This is very important. You're running your life. In other words, in the market economy, you are running your life. You are left alone because you don't need help. The government may tax you for resources, but the government's, will, like with the class, because they'll deal with thieves, criminals, people trying to steal things, and they're going to try to help things that are going wrong. They're going to provide resources for people who are having difficulties, or for building something like, sometimes they'll say highway system or something like that. They're trying to do things that function. They're establishing a good legal structure and stuff like that. And this is why, I have this old, cartoon there is in the sense of, they're using those things to create it. In fact, one of the things that, private properties and such. So the government is concerned with helping people, but it tends to leave you in general alone. It trusts the markets and firms to deliver things. Singapore has been a free market country. It is a free market country. Taiwan, of course, has been a free market country since they retreated from China. The United States functions best when we are a free market country because of our cultural traits. I don't even mean high utility. I just mean our cultural traits are nonconformist. Even for the most leftists among us who want this giant government and wants to create everything, they tend to be nonconformist. So in the market economy, a lot of individuals are making the decisions. The government's dealing with the potholes. The government can be big. Now, if you remember the thing from, I didn't write down these things, and you can go back and check the slides, and the PowerPoints are available in the class. But you can go and look and say, wait a minute, if we look at the market economy, it says the government's usually can be between 10 and 15%. Let's say 10 here. And 30. In other words, you have a rather large government here allocating resources. You can have a small government allocating resources. Now, and so when you go to manage, that's going to be from 25, again, an overlap, because the high end of market economy, regarding size of government, can low end with the low end of what's next one, which is managed economy. But the philosophy of government is different. As I said, in the market economy, the government's filling in potholes, helping things that have gone wrong and stuff like that. It doesn't, the market is functioning like toilet paper is delivered by the market. We don't buy the toilet paper. In other words, anything that's functioning, we're leaving alone. We're dealing with things that may have gone wrong or something like that, where the government's maybe, even if it's big, it's tinkering around the edges. That's an important distinction. Then there's the managed economy. Now, the managed economy, this is the first of the neo-Keynesian outlook, is a different point of view. The government in general is now going to be coordinating and directing the economy. In other words, there's a different philosophical point. I have this quote from Keynes. I'm sorry it shrank. But, he said, in this quote, but it shows you a mentality. That's why the government's there. And I apologize, my head's sticking. I am. Is capitalism is the belief that the most wicked of people will do the most wicked of things for the greatest good of all. And that's a distinction here. Now, this is a direct quote from Keynes. The guy who, now in fairness to Keynes, he did not say, name this economic theory after him. Other people called it Keynesianism after him. He did not call himself Keynes. But that's what it became. So it just kind of stays there, and because I'll rag on Keynes a number of times, but it wasn't his fault. It was called Keynesianism, or eventually developed to neo-Keynesianism. But now look at his mentality. That's the mentality of the managed economy, and that add-in will be in the socialist economy. Is the view of the people in the marketplace, wicked people who are just after acquiring wealth. So the government becomes the man with the plan to coordinate, to direct things. The government's going to try to run the economy and direct the economy like a coach or a manager. You may own your factory, the government will tell you. So, for example, in Europe, they have the mandate of they're going to phase out all gas banging engines, all standard gasoline engines in cars by 2035. After 2035, there will be no more gasoline engines or diesel engines produced in Europe. It'll all be electric. That's a managed economy. A market economy would say, hey, cars, they function. Whatever supply and demand says, that's fine. Well, we got this eco. No, they just say whatever supply and demand says is fine. The market will solve it. A managed economy, the government's saying they're going to coordinate and direct things to achieve a better outcome, to achieve something that works for the greater good of all and such. And that's what's happening with the managed economy. I want to try to make the world and the such a better place. Again, I'm not being cruel or anything like that. I am pointing out the nature of it. And so it gives you, like I said, the government's going to allow you to operate own firms, but the government's going to give you directions for the greater good of the nation, the population, because this will result in a better outcome. Now, in their normative opinion, but remember, if I'm seeking to do this, the idea behind this is the government has made the plan giving a direction. Now, as you go from managed socialism to communism, there's going to be beliefs similar to Keynes. The quote, we'll add in, especially there'll be excessive poverty. Let me deal with the example of managed economy. The Affordable Health Care Act was managed economy. Now, in a managed economy, the government's going to, so for example, under the Affordable Health Care Act, I'm kind of a chunky monkey. I get about 30 odd pounds. I should not have. I should be about 30 pounds lighter than I am, maybe 40. I'm not in bad shape for an old dude, but that's just what reality is. Okay. Now, under the Affordable Health Care Act, I can be denied health care. Now, why are they doing that? They want to force everybody to be better, do regular checkups, be physically fit. They're going to ban certain foods because these foods are bad. Okay, that's a managed economy. Why are we doing this? To control healthcare costs, because people are healthier because they're not doing bad things. See, in the free market, the market economy, hey, you want to go and eat donuts, have fun. Managed economy, say we want to control healthcare costs. We're going to restrict that. Now, this is very important, though. If I'm doing this the idea of control. If they were doing this, instead of being a true managed economy, being rational, cost efficient, saving resources, because the government will do better, coordinating, save resources, we're going to ban certain activity, than the Affordable Health Care Act, instead of promoting sodomy and you know, just people being, pigs and sleeping around and stuff like that, the government would say, the Affordable Health Act would say, boom, if you're engaged in sodomy, you're going to be denied health care. Not because we care about what your proclivities are, it's because sodomy is a very medically unhealthy thing to do. And by eliminating sodomy, we reduce healthcare costs. So, for example, the guy who eats donuts, which the government wants to restrict, right? That's why New York City for a while was banning 2-liter bottles of soda because, it's killing people. It's killing people, right? Okay. But they were promoting people being alternatively preferenced and people being sexually licentious. Well, when people are alternatively preferenced because you sleep around a lot of people, promiscuity promote too, which is part of the other two. You've average life expectancies for a male in the early 40s. If you're a female, in the early 50s. So you're shaving a few decades off your life expectancy. If I eat too many donuts when I'm overweight, I may be shaving a year or two off my life expectancy. Wait a minute. Why am I not getting to these things? Not because, heck, just like you'd be banning pornography. Leading cause of male, inability to perform, the second leading cause, is pornography. Leading cause of female infertility is promiscuity. Well, infertility treatments are massively expensive. In other words, if nobody's involved until marriage, infertility drops like a stone, which means how much you have to spend on fertility treatments. You won't. But if people are all over the place, like, doing bad things from a Christian perspective, but from an economic perspective, from an expense, a cost. But so, in other words, when the Affordable Health Care Act allowed and promoted certain activities, that is not efficient. That does not cause productivity. You see what I mean? In other words, so when the government's the mayor of the plan, it's interesting. So, for example, in Germany, a lot of people want this in the United States. You have to put out your trash in segmented bins. And I do mean segmented bins, like this bin, that bin, that bin, paper here, organic there, plastics there, metal there, and I think there's another category I can't remember. And if you put a piece of trash in the wrong bin, you get fined. And you have different trucks come out to get each of the bins. And they all go to different, theoretically different recycling centers. In other words, the comp thing is very energy intensive. When you're running more trucks than you need to, it's very energy intensive. Of which Germans have made the energy very expensive. Okay, they have people do that because they're trying to save the environment, and so that's the man's economy. I point these two not to show it's to show the inconceivable. A man's economy would be restricting certain activities because they're medically expensive and you can stop them. Socialism. Now, socialism is part of neo-Keynesianism. Now, socialism, everything in neo-Keynesianism, the government being a man of the plan, is in socialism. But socialism raises two other things to a high point. One is the idea that the government can run certain industries better than the private sector. So you hear a lot of people talk about socialized medicine. In a man's economy, the government's just telling you how to do certain things in order to save and resource, stuff like that. The government says, we found these things work, you should do this. In the managed economy, in the socialist economy, it's determined maybe it'd be better for the government to run. Now, the government's not running every communism, the government owns and runs everything. In socialism, there'll be certain industries the government will be controlling and running for two general reasons. One, the government will be more efficient. So they're saying, first, we're going to control and run this industry because the government will be more efficient. Second, we're going to control and run that industry because the government's going to be better for everybody else. So we're looking at redistributing income to make society, large scale redistribution, to make society more stable. You may have redistribution in a market or a managed economy, but a lot of times in those things, it's just alleviating the poor. Here is the idea we'll alleviate it because it'll leave general pressures on society and make the poor of it, and they'll have the belief that people should not be so rich, that the absurd, I'm borrowing from the social space, the absurd discrepancy between the two causes disruption, causes an instability. And so again, the socialists agree with what I said about Keynes saying the most wicked people, so they'll view the capitalist, the person who's producing a building, as a wicked person. Don't mind me. I'm drinking juice. So they're looking for a fairer system, and they'll believe it's more efficient. Now, I say positive examples: Canada, France, should be here. Some Swedes would have, and the Danes especially more than the Swedes. Most of the Danes would say they're not socialists because they do not put heavy controls on their firms. In other words, in Denmark, you have control over your people to provide goods for them and stuff like that. You tax them and stuff like that rather vigorously. You don't control your firms. The firms are given a lot of latitude. So when we look at those three economic systems, what is made? The firms. Danish socialists are very low-end managed economy people. Those are still in the managed because they are providing some direction. But who gets what? And and how is it made? They have a big thing on that. So it's you can have a gradient through here, but the philosophical points I raise. Now I have this graph in a sense of and keep in mind I'm gonna use some of these things. Sometimes they're gonna and other things may lie. Like this one is the assert this. There are 27 empty houses for each person who wants a house. Well, they just give it to the homeless people. That's a cruelty of capitalism. Well, no, what they're doing is they're calling any place that may be currently up for sale because it's up for sale. For example, one of the reasons New York City has an apartment shortage is because The mandates of the city government and the state government make the cost of renovating apartments so expensive. They are stunning. In fact, there's a thing YouTube about talking how commie blocks, the old things the communists built, these giant, square apartment buildings and stuff like that, are great. We should have those back. The funny thing is if commie blocks were built in the United States, they wouldn't be allowed because they violated building safety codes, fire standards, living standards, stuff like that. They violate all these things that governments create as rules, which is always going to be the thing people pick on socialism about in man's economy, is the government exempts itself, or worse, going through both of them, is when you, and I'm going back to Affordable Health Care a number of times, when you grant exemptions. Equality under the law is very important. Once people find they can get exemptions, they are allowed to do things. They will seek them. They will seek special exemptions. Economists across the board, again, ruling out communists because they're psycho nuts. The functional ones here. You have socialist economies, neo-Keynesian socialists, stuff like that, free marketists. They all believe in equality under the law. I must run everything by the same standard. We'll hit that a number of times. It gets weakened. We have a lot of, jabbing between each of them. But the idea is the sense of this one. I have the percentage of millionaires. So that other one on the right, which you can't see because my head's blocking it, is the number of millionaires in Congress. And so that's the percentage of millionaires in Congress. Don't mind me, it's my wife. She's adorable. I'm not, but she is. I married well. I love you too, beautiful. But I did marry well. I'm not gonna lie about that one. But but going back to millionaires in Congress, they point out the millionaires. Now the funny thing here, right, is they point out millionaires in Congress. If we're talking about the Chinese Congress, which is still by its definition and by its constitution a communist country, China doesn't have percentage of millionaires. It has percentage of billionaires. But wait a minute, that's an income redistribution society. Yes, who are your billionaires? They're all connected with the government. That's going to be a failure. We're going to talk about a number of times. And then there's communism. All right, communism, the government runs everything. There's nothing you have the government cannot take from you. Your life is for the government. Communism totally sucks eggs. In fact, calling it sucking eggs is an insult to sucking eggs. Communism, the only thing communism ever delivered is bodies, lots of dead bodies, oodles of dead bodies, like so many dead bodies, you cannot believe the number of dead bodies. Communism's done that. Communism has, destroyed ecologies. I mean, totally destroyed ecologies. Made massive poverty, incredibly massive poverty. Has cheated people. Theoretically, a system dedicated to the peasant worker classes consumed peasant worker classes' lives in immensity. And the easiest way I can say it is look at the way they fight wars. They use people like they were nothing. The Korean War being a good example. For every American that died, about 70 North Korean and Chinese soldiers died. See, the Chinese didn't worry about logistic chain because they expected their troops to die. So they marched them in, knowing most of these guys were going to die, and they were sending more behind them. In the battle of, I meant, at least for this, a North Korean harbor. The Marines were being evacuated in the Korean War. No, in times we invaded. Hunan, right? During that withdrawal, being evacuated, just to give you an idea, the Chinese came in waves. Now, the United States has set up a few Iowa-class battleships. And Iowa-class battleships throw 16-inch shells, basically a ton and a half shells, and they also use a lot of 5-inch shells. It's almost like a little bit smaller than standard artillery rounds, but because it's all rigged up in the battleship, they can fire very quickly. The Chinese came and they got butchered, but they kept coming. In other words, the only reason we could have stayed there, in fact, the Marines and Navy said, stay here. We can hold this harbor indefinitely. We will have this knife pointing into the guts of North Korea, and the Chinese will just keep feeding men to take out this harbor, and there's nothing they can do because it's open ground leading to it. They won't be able to shell out people in it because the artillery can't reach it. If they try to bring artillery that can reach, the 16-inch guns are battle. We don't even have to worry about bombing with planes. We can destroy it with naval artillery. And you know, and the Chinese fed men, they did not care. A system theoretically dedicated because the ideology was so important. These screwballs here, all of them, who theoretically cared about people. They were willing to let people die in immense numbers for it. And I'll pick on them, these guys. I'll just rag on Marx, for example. Marx, when his father died, he had 6 brothers and sisters. Now his father was reasonably wealthy, and the mother had most of the money to take care of the minor children because they had minor children. He was an adult, and he whined to his mother saying, because he went through his inheritance like hot knife through butter. He loved living high in the hog, and he went to his mother and said, "Why are you so greedy and selfish? I need more." And it's like, I have to provide for your youngest brothers and sisters who are not adults yet and can't work. And you're like, well, you're just greedy and selfish. I need more. And that's the way he viewed life. And that's the way they. So we're gonna. Yeah, I mean, as I said, death, ecological devastation, the discounting of human beings. And so communism far more fulfills, Keynes's quote. High utility, high principle, I mentioned this already, is needed in government. You need a government that has high principle, high utility, high morality. Right, wrong, good, evil. In other words, in whatever it is. Now, a free market economy can go with a government that's less functional because the government has small power. In other words, a free market economy can suffer. The guy on the top there, the big guy with the big belly, the cartoon of, that's Boss Tweed. You can suffer him with merely just a slowing of growth. He was the one the corrupt politician who basically ran New York City for several decades. You can suffer for him because most of the economy is not run by the government. In fact, he, bribes, kickbacks, stuff like that, corruption, but not debilitating or full, because the government didn't have that many places it could be corrupt with. And he could be removed easily. A socialist government, a communist government, like the guy there on the right, that's Pol Pot, the sweet-looking guy there. He slaughtered millions. He destroyed half the population of his country. In fact, I have glasses, which you see me put them on and off just because you understand. I'm sitting here doing this class, and I'll stand up occasionally when doing a lecture, stuff like that, because I am a mobile. I even if I had me, I go up and down the classroom. I am moving. So sitting here talking, I'm like, ah. So if I seem manic, that's why. If I get up occasionally, that's why. I gotta move. Pol Pot actually made, if you had glasses, that was a sign of being a Western capitalist oppressor, and he'd kill people for having glasses. Idiot. That means Pol Pot. This is not a fashion thing of I'm getting Ray-Bans or something. It's I am bloody nearsighted. That's why I wear glasses. He didn't care. Now I point this out. Like many like many school teachers, Pol Pot became a communist. In other words, he had this great grand vision, which Thomas Sowell, a great, new classical economist, warned. How these people have this cosmic vision. They want to make this better world, and their better world is worth the price of any average human being paying for it, because it's their better world. You know, and they're going to create a hell on earth for common people because it's worth any price they believe common people should pay. Because they'll say, like an old TV show from 2 decades ago, they'll thank me for it later. And they don't. I pick on number leftist billion. I tend to pick on the billion. You can see this, the ultra rich and the megacorps are going to tend to favor a managed economy or socialism. And actually, the reason is actually simple. The government, they like getting in bed with government because government can make them money. And government will create barriers. It will prevent other people from competing, from rising up. So there'll be a handful of billionaires running everything. I don't think I have a picture of Klaus Schwab here. Klaus Schwab would be the two, who would be running everything. And us peasants won't have anything. You won't be able to produce, build, get better. You're just going to be one of the cogs, one of the giant machines, the government. And they like that because they don't like answering to the population. They don't like making things people like. Hey, you're Bezos, you do Amazon. Amazon's TV division loses. I mean, he makes, these shows that lose money. They spent several billion on the Rings of Power. Its viewership does not justify that. Heck, I admit I watched, I watched something, what was it called, Invincible. A little gory, very gory. But you know what? Once one of the major characters had an abortion for no other reason than the fact of it's to show abortion's sake. I'm like, you know what? Forget that. In fact, that's a loss of high too, as we'll see later. Why'd she have an abortion? I was feeling bad. She saw so little of her child. Her child just exists for her. So she killed it. Totally narcissistic behavior. But they're making, a fantasy item. But, that went against my beliefs. They were doing that because they wanted to what? Promote abortion. Just they, mostly shows promote things I don't like and I don't watch them. Now you can do that, but you pay in the market, you pay the price for doing it. Well, what it is, see, he wants the government to reimburse him for his failures. Most of these billionaires here, you'll want that kind of constraint. The funny thing is, if any of them had the socialism they all want once they're billionaires, except for Buffett, the bald white-haired guy on the right, none of them would have been billionaires. Buffett would have been, because Buffett's whole creation, if you have me in micro, I told us already, his whole economic empire was built on knowing the government. It was his father, who, in fairness to his father, he was a small government guy, didn't believe he was the government, stuff like that. Buffett saw the quarters of power, how you make money, and from the time he was your age, he was in those halls of panels. He had connections right off. That's why he promotes a lot of things that don't function, because it makes him better off. And he promoted he said all these things will be great. I can take it. And he made sure he had exemptions. It was Buffett's financial house can engage in chicanery. That if the standard financial trading house did that, you'd go to jail. Buffett has an exemption from rules. Totally unethical. That's why your billionaires are going to tend to back socialism, because, as we'll see later, it creates a lot of blockages, a lot of weights that prevents the economy from functioning. Okay, now going to the 10 principles of economics, and I'm going to try to go through these. Once we finish these, I'll stop, or I'll probably, because you can always stop these things. Just saying, why don't you do the whole thing? And sometimes what it is I'm using an entirely new system here, Canvas and the recording system and such, and I'll be posting these. I'll try to get them all posted on YouTube. So, and I'm not going to lie about this. In other words, that's why I have the intro video saying, hey, We're gonna have some of these, quirks getting things ready. I know that. I ask for forbearance, and except for the quizzes which are set. Please, the quizzes are easy. Don't mess those up. Just do them, and we'll be in. We're gonna have the snafus and stuff like that. I apologize. I'm not trying to be anything. Okay, now these are 10 principles of macro. I pull them from ManQ. Because I pull these from ManQ, and again, you violate positives, you get hurt. These are 10 principles of macro. Now, I'm not going to say that they're all functional and stuff like that. Well, actually, these are all basically functional. We're going to talk about as we go along. I apologize. Okay, on the macro level, you face a trade-off. We do not like it. We face a trade-off between efficiency and equity. And the reason I'm using the highlighting as opposed to the lining is because the highlighting works better. Makes a nice thick line. It's useful. But we have a trade-off between equity and efficiency. If I want, or if they say I'm buying this thing here, equity and equality, efficiency and equity is better. Now, equity means the same slice of pie. In other words, you have a pie, it's sliced up, and everyone gets the same sliced pie. That's equity. The same result for everybody. Efficiency means getting more productivity, more output, and stuff like that. Now, this cartoon is from an equity person. They're trashing equality, where everyone's treated by the same rules. Doing equity, which everyone gets the same outcome, and see they're all better. Now, the funny thing here is, remember, all these kids are viewing the game illegally, which is kind of a funny thing. And they're making the assumption, the people on the equity side, that the government can reallocate resources for a better, efficient outcome, which is always questionable. If I could run things I want, but results have shown that if I want efficiency, which means people produce, they build, they work, they create, I am not going to have equity. I'm not going to have the equality of results. I'm not going to have equity of results. That if I pursue efficiency, I will have unequal results. If I pursue unequal results, I'm going to have, less efficiency because there is no incentive. We just have that trade-off. The pitch to the right assumes what they call the static world and that we can flawlessly reallocate resources. That doesn't happen. And again, they call it equality. Equality in law or fairness is also going to come to people say, well, wait a minute. Why should the person who waste all their money get what I get when I diligently work regularly? Like one of the ones they have in school now is an old fable called The Ant and the Grasshopper. The ant, works all year long, stores up storage. The grasshopper, plays. When he gets to winter, the ant is comfortable and taken care of, which is why the Bible says, look the ways of the ant, the sluggard. And the grasshopper gets to winter and he dies. Now they have a new children's fable where they're practicing, equity, and the ant is giving resources to poor grasshopper. And he promises he won't do anymore because then the ant showed the grasshopper how to work. No, the grasshopper knew what work was. The grasshopper did not want to do work. That's it. I'm not being cruel. That's the whole point. So the ant realizes why work when I'm just, putting stuff in. It's all going to the other guy. And people say, oh, people should learn to be better. Now you're trying to change utility. That is always going to be very difficult. And a lot of times when you change utility, you have high utility especially, you get a different result. Remember we talked about envy already. People and firms respond to incentives. Now, Napoleon, it's funny, Napoleon said, give me enough medals and I will win you any war. And what are medals for? Recognition of bravery. In fact, the Soviet Union abolished medals when it became a Soviet Union. Communist country, they abolished medals, early in the revolution, and they got into the Second World War, and a lot of troops were like, they fought because they're told to fight, but they didn't do anything exceptional. Some did, but not many. The Soviets realized they needed medals. They needed accomplishments so people would be recognized for what they're doing. Because fighting is really dangerous stuff, and people want to be noted for what they did. So, for example, there's a tanker, a Soviet tanker, Russian tanker, in the Second World War. In July, just after the invasion, he was a 17-year-old. He walked into the recruiting center. You would draft a Soviet, but he was going in early, and he volunteered and became a tanker. And he fought all the way to the fall of Berlin. He got through the whole war. You'd see this old guy, and he'd have his uniform, and he earned that. He was like, he was in most of the major engagements on the Eastern Front. What's that say? That is one serious bad-butted dude. Because why? And because it's an acknowledgement, and that's incentive. So the Soviets brought back medals. Okay, sometimes weird things happen, right? Now again, I'm going to mention these two items here, and then we're going to take the ripple from one. Okay, when the speed limit changed. Now in the United States, back in a man's economy thought, because we ran a man's economy from the mid-60s to like 1981, the United States lowered the speed limit to 55 on all the major highways. Because this will save fuel and there'll be more fuel for everyone, stuff like that. This will reduce fuel usage by about 10% for the same miles driven. A very, man's economy thing. The other thing they said, it would reduce highway deaths. Now, the interesting thing is when they raised the speed limit 3 decades ago, they said, okay, we're going to let states determine their speed limit because people really want it. In other words, it's people just saying they wanted the speed limit to be raised. Well, the interesting thing is when people say we raise the speed limit from 55 to 65 or 70, even 75, people saying, oh, you're killing an extra 10,000 people. Why do you want to kill people? Why are you trying to kill people? Well, I mean, keep in mind, when people say that, go back to Healthcare Act. When people say, I'm going to promote promiscuity, I'm going to promote, all sorts of different, guess what? You're killing people. If people didn't do anything until they were married, life expectancies go up, medical uses go down, deaths go down, stuff like that. Why are they killing people? Oh, they want to do that. Make up your mind. Well, the funny thing is when I supported raising the speed limit because it's a free society to let people make choices. If they make a bad choice, they pay for it. If they're responsible for an accident, they pay for it. Well, the interesting thing is when they raised the speed limit, we didn't get a rise in deaths. There weren't these 10 or 15,000 extra deaths. In fact, in some areas, deaths actually went down a little bit, 1 or 2%. They did not go up. Now, in true economic fashion, a number of economists asked, why, and I asked this question too, why did they not go up? And the two rational answers were actually totally consistent. One, when the speed limit was 55, a number of people were still doing 75. We're doing 75 when everyone's supposed to do 55. Those people were weaving around cars. Because a person would get in a high-speed lane saying, I'm doing 55, the speed limit's 55, I could be in a high-speed lane. And so you would have people weaving constantly. And when you're weaving around through traffic, you're more likely to cause accidents. Once the speed limit became 75, all of a sudden, people were doing this. They'd stay in their lanes because why? This lane is doing 70. This lane is doing 60. In other words, people sorted them out pretty quickly. And so there weren't as many lane changes. But not only were there as many lane changes, when you have a faster speed limit, at any given point, there are fewer people on the road. Because think about it, if I have to go 60 miles, if I'm doing 55, I'm on that road for about an hour and 5 to 10 minutes. If I'm on that road and I'm doing 75, I'm on that road for about 50 minutes. I've just freed up 15 to 20 minutes of road time for somebody else to be in the road. In other words, for a certain section, there's one less person on the road. Because why? I'm going faster, which means I'm spending less time on the road, which means there's more space in the road. And as far as I've seen, no one ever done a study of the reduction of congestion. I'm just standing right now because, roughly speaking, my leg's getting stiff. I'm old. But that reduced traffic congestion. Okay, I'm mentioning, welfare. When welfare was created, the idea was to alleviate the suffering of the poor, to alleviate the situation the poor have, how they're suffering something. I am not being cruel. I mean it in the direct sense of there are people in poverty, desperate poverty. We want to give them access, to give them a chance, to cover them when they are hurting, when they're having a bad time. Perfectly good concept. A number of people, when welfare was created, started exploiting it. In some parts of the United States, you'd have young men who would get young women pregnant because she'd get pregnant, illegitimately. The government would pay for her support, and then the young man could come along and say, "Where's my share of the check?" In fact, in some of the United States, it was called Father's Day when the welfare checks come in, because that's when the fathers would show up to get their cut of the money. And really speaking, they live in the system. Welfare raised illegitimacy in the United States from 3% when they started large scale to in the mid 40s. In other words, for the last 2 decades, welfare has bounced, the illegitimacy rate, children born out of birth, has ranged between 40% and 49%. Nearly half our children are born out of wedlock. When we do cultural institutions like marriage at the very end, we'll come back to that one. But that's an incentive. We create an incentive to push people towards illegitimacy. Because why? It made them money. Okay, unlay that, but go back to number one, which normally I'd go back, but the recording method does not let you go back because it records each thing attached to a slide. So occasionally I'll jump forward in the slide and be like, I'll be explaining backwards. But, go back to number one, the equity versus efficiency thing. If I kill incentives, see, the equity people say I can seriously reallocate resources. But if there are no resources to reallocate, I can't have anybody looking over the thing, because why? There's no resources. And then go back to envy. The people who can't look over feel it is unfair that somebody else could look over, and they chop off his legs. And they're saying, "Oh, that wouldn't happen." Go back to communism, the dead people. Markets are normally a good way to organize economic activity. Now, what you have there is a supply and demand graph. Now, the implication is simple. Individuals and firms, supply and demand, are on average an effective way of allocating resources. Now, you notice it says normally. I have no problem with that. Normally is a qualified statement. In other words, Mankiw is saying that if you're gonna have soap, steak, French fries, green beans, tires, toilet paper, markets are a great way to do that. But normally is a qualified. It means not always. There may be a rationale for doing something else or interfering or having a check in something else that is qualified. Now, because it's qualified, the implication is that, individuals for assignment, they do some job, but not perfect. Now, we do supply and demand in some detail, not as much as micro. We'll hit that again, but that's a normal, which I have no problem with. But then that's a qualification, which means this has to be a qualification. And I'm probably going to stop this one because, again, our recording. As I said, I'm getting used to this system. You will have all the recordings. Just getting it. International trade may make a nation better off. Now, I admit, I have altered this. The book says makes a nation better off. I put in the may. Now, the reason I put in the may is the fact of all trade is excuse me, all trade is markets between systems. That's all it is. In other words, let's take Switzerland here. Trade between North and South Carolina is greater than Switzerland. In other words, the trading between different pieces of the United States is far greater than the trade between many of these countries that's shown small here and stuff like that. And that's shown relative to the size of the country, item, stuff like that. So it doesn't actually have an item that big. It's just pointing up. Excuse me, I apologize for the burp. It's not intentional. So all free trade is markets between countries. So trade is always good between Switzerland or Austria and Hungary. If it's always good between Austria and Hungary, then why is markets, free trade, because all market is, why is that always good between North and South Carolina? It's because all international trade is markets between countries. If you say, well, countries are bigger, no, they're not. U.S. states are economically bigger than most countries. A funny thing has happened. Our poor state, Mississippi, has a higher standard of living than the United Kingdom per person. I am not being cruel here, something like that. So when you're saying these things, we have to be careful. So if markets normally make a nation better off, then trade may make nations better off. If I'm going to qualify markets, I must qualify trade. If trade is an absolute, then markets are an absolute, because all international trade is markets between countries. That's it. That's all it is, and that's an important. Again, I'm not even being cruel here because it's an important item. And again, it's not even size. When we're talking markets between countries, it's not even talking about size because of the scale of things, because the nature of how things work. Okay, I'm going to, you know, stop here. You can stop here just because I've gone an hour, so I'm going to stop recording. And here we go. Now we're looking at here. We've just done, the first few items, incentives, trade can make country better off, and international trade is always good. And again, these things I said, those two are in conflict. We had people respond to incentives. We talk about efficiency versus equity. Do you want the same size pie slices? Do you want a bigger pie? And we talk about how one led to trouble with two. You lose incentives, you lose productivity. You lose efficiency, you lose the pie shrinks. I talked the inconsistency between markets always being good, markets sometimes may make a nation better off, qualified on average, and international trade always makes a nation better off. They both have to be qualified or unqualified. I make them both qualified. Now here, this is one now, I quote Landez here, Wealth in Five Nations. David Landez is a brilliant economist. I've enjoyed all of his works. He is a neo-Keynesian. In take honesty, I am a new classicalist. When economists are functioning well, we look at what things done and what have been proven and not proven. Say, hey, that works. That does work. This does not work. I see your conditions. It work under those situations. That normative. And so, if I thought those kind of things, and we borrow things from each other. So this is a point that Landez actually, for lack of a better term, borrows from what you could say is the more cautious sides. Governments, in theory, can improve outcomes. So it's a well-functioning, a good-use government, functioning well with lots of, for a second, say high morality, high utility, with principles stuff like that, can do great things for a nation. It can move things forward. So Linda says governors like to go with a little blonde curl. When she's good, she is very, very good. When she is bad, she is horrid. In terms of, the government can magnify or destroy things. And governments have done a lot of destroying, but they have magnified. I'll take an example of this. This is one Dave Landis used because a number of governments have failed epically. But when Japan opened up, when Japan was forced to open up, they had the 300 years, the shogunate, which basically froze them in neutrality. Literally speaking, they spent 300 years not moving forward. Their economy, fortunate enough for them, was reasonably free, so they had a dynamic internal market sector of people buying, selling, improving, stuff like that. But they were ossified. The government was ossified. When they were forced to interact with the rest of the world, they stayed ossified. In other words, they didn't understand how truly backward they were. And the government didn't care. They were sure. In fact, what happened? The Japanese emperor, triggers the shogun had all the power. The Japanese emperor triggered a coup because he's actually theoretically the head of state, the head of the country. He triggered a coup to overthrow the shogunate, to allow Japanese, modernization, because they were behind. The government said, okay, send people overseas, have them get engineering degrees, have them get science degrees, have them learn other countries' literature, stuff like that. Let's get up to speed. How they do and stuff like that. The Japanese said, we will catch up. The Japanese government says, we will help ourselves catch up. And many people realize the first, Japanese Navy, built in the late 19th century, was built in British shipyards. In other words, they contract the British. We can't build our own ships yet. They contract the British to build them ships. They send people to observe, how do you do this? How do you do steel working? They, duplicated other countries. In other words, how do I learn? In other words, they went and said, so this is a very proactive, good government. They got themselves forward. They moved themselves, and that's when your government's good. When your government's bad, when it's kleptocratic, when it clings to things that don't work, when it's just concerned with itself. A funny one to incorporate this one. This is just a comical one. In the U.S., and the other major countries are all trying to make mag weapons, magnetic driven weapons and stuff like that. They launch a slugger because they accelerate it magnetically. Okay, to give you an idea how stupid these things are, massively, massively expensive. A 16-inch shell, circa 1945, 16-inch shell gun will hit with, if I remember right, I believe it's 5 times the kinetic. Was it 5 times? It might have been 50 times kinetic energy of one of these mag guns for a minuscule portion of the cost in terms of making and building the whole gun barrel and stuff like that. Turrets are going to be common either one, but it's a fantastically cheap to do. Why are we doing this expensive, wasteful maglev thing? It's new, it's efficient, it's better, but it's inferior in actually doing damage to the target and actually penetrating the target. No, it's better. That's government stupidity. Why? Because a lot of people get contracts for building something that does not work well. That's inefficiency. So the government, because, again, remember the government's weakness. It has no easy way of measuring, and somebody else pays the cost. When somebody else pays the cost, the government gets massively inefficient. Anybody does when somebody else pays the cost. It's just firms, individuals are self-contained. They get the benefit of their actions, and they pay the cost of their actions. The government does not. It doesn't mean we don't use government. It just says it's a cost of the government. And I said, Landis believes the government can help these things. That's why, if Landis were, advising, he'd be like, okay, yeah, we're doing the ACA Act. He goes, okay, you're gonna go after fat people. You're gonna have to basically go after people who are sexually promiscuous. You have to go after people with other bad behaviors and stuff like that, because why? They cost a lot. I'm not being cruel here. It's for the consistency. Because again, economic systems. I throw comments out to the side, but that range of economic systems all want equality of law because it works. Once you make exceptions, boom, you destroy it. Okay, a country's productivity, standard of living, depends on productivity. These are nations. The map, that really distorted, weird-looking map, is nation size weighted by GDP. The colors are just basically the continents. That's all. The different colors basically just continents. Japan was given a different color and stuff like that. Europe's that purple one. The Americans, the Japanese are basically the blue. But look at the scale of that. Those nations are weighted by GDP in terms of, and so a country's standard of living, how well you live and stuff like that, is based on productivity. A lot of times, going back to an inefficiency of number 5, is people call things efficient when they're not. Well, yeah, but the government wants to do that, so it's efficient. What was the thing? Australia's saying Australia's going to have the whole transportation grid electric by 2035. And they say it's more efficient because we're using free, clean, green energy. And that'll be more efficient. Well, is energy free? No, you have to build all the capacity to make the energy. But people like to repeat something because it sounds well. Yeah, but it's not reality. I'm not being cruel here. So standard of living depends on productivity. The Germans, for example, their standard of living, I believe, is now slid below the poorest U.S. state. And one of the reasons for that is the fact of the Germans have engaged in policies that don't work, that drive up cost, that reduce standard of living. Standard of living is depending on productivity. A lot of productivity is, can I produce it cheaper? Can I make it better? Do I get more bang for the buck? The German government said, no, we just want it this way. It's very bad north. Your government, you can think that way. But when the government tries to think that way, it totally bolos its population. Its population pays for that. So yes, your country, I have to be sitting there looking at productivity, looking at efficiency, because if I'm not, I'm going to get destroyed. I'm going to get annihilated. And I need to have that to be doing it. Wondering why I pause with talking, it's basically because I have to constantly moving the mouse pad to get that little itty bitty tiny little arrow. Whereas normally I can hit the arrow over here. Make sure hit it once. Okay, this is one we're gonna see. We get in the third section. We're gonna see this in a few weeks. Prices rise and the government prints money. The government printing money is bad. It is very bad. When I sit there, you're swinging gasoline while smoking. I mean that. You do not print money to spend. Printing money to spend is a bad thing. Governments do that. That'll cause something. That'll create hyperinflation and inflation. When the government prints money, you get inflation. A lot of people don't like that. Irrelevant. It is supremely irrelevant. It is just what it is. I said I'm not being cruel or anything like that. You print money, you get trouble. And so the government, should be very careful about printing money. In fact, it shouldn't be printing money. Well, I'm a person who believes in low and negative inflation because that benefits the general population, particularly the poor and the middle. Inflation tends to benefit the government. Lots of inflation tends to fudge everybody over. Related to this, there is a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It's theoretically, again, we do matcha pots because theoretically, I can lower my unemployment rate at the price of higher inflation. The government can change out a little bit more money, cause higher inflation, but lower the unemployment rate. And so this seems to be what's called a short-run trade-off. This has been confirmed across theories. You know, it's way back in the 60s, there was a belief, there was a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In other words, when you had high inflation, you had low unemployment. And when you had low inflation, you had high unemployment. That was, because then it was discovered, no, actually, that's just a short run trade off. In other words, in the short run, I can say, I'm going to reduce my unemployment, get a lot more jobs, we're going to have high inflation. But if I want low inflation, I'm going to have higher unemployment. What we discovered is, no, you can have low unemployment and low inflation, and you can have high unemployment and high inflation. But in the here and now, in the short run, there is a trade off. If you're not careful, that's the thing I'm just pointing out, a country can end up with both, and many countries do this too often. The United States, we hit 9+% inflation in 2022. In fact, during the late noughts and the early teens, we hit 9-10% inflation with government policy. Basically, the government wanted to spend money, and they turned on the printing presses. When we do monetary policy, come back to that. So there's that trade-off there. The short run is static, the long run is dynamic. Go back to a number of the earlier slides. A number of the actions we talk about incentives, reactions, efficiency versus equity, a number of times in a static model. In other words, chess is one of the few things computers can beat people at because chess is static. And even chess, you have to make a supercomputer. In other words, invest hundreds of millions of dollars to be the chess master. That's a static game. That doesn't alter. So the short run is static. You play with the hands you are dealt. You use the pieces you have. Now, you may try to get the best of them. That's why we go to markets and trade, try to get the best of what we have. The long run is dynamic. Take Japan. Japan opens up. It's 1850. I believe it was 1853. Japan opens up. It's a static world for the Japanese. How do I get better? The dynamic, that's the long run. How do I learn? How do I improve? How do I adjust? How do I adapt? So when you go back to those earlier slides, something worked initially, but then you start to get damages, or something, you adjusted something and you start getting bigger improvements and such. A chess game is static. A baseball game, even when you're playing it with the pieces you have, is not, because we can't tabulate all the outcomes. Chess can be tabulated. That board can be fully tabulated. We can know exactly everything that's going to happen. That is a 8x8, 64 square board. There are 32 pieces. There you go. Every theoretical outcome can be done. Even then, the outcomes are so numerous, they're almost inquantifiable. And part of it's trying to figure out what the other guy's going to do with his theoretically limited choices. But there's so many choices, then they're infinite. But you imagine playing a chess game in the real world, using chess analogy in the real world, right? A pawn could decide, you know what, being a pawn stinks. I'm pawn number 3 here. You know what I am? I'm a dead man walking. Here you are. You're a dead man walking. No one cares about you. The pawn may make decisions that all of a sudden this pawn is going forward, and then they change, and that pawn becomes a queen all of a sudden. Why? Because the pawn made decisions. In fact, this is one of the points the new classicalists, the free market and the market economy people say is, when you have a freer economy, the pawns become better pieces on their own because it's in their interest, and they make the pie bigger. They make things more efficient. When you have more of a command economy, managed particularly socialism and communism, you're frozen as a pawn. The state has decided what you are. You can't improve. In other words, take Michael Jordan. The state would have decided when Michael Jordan didn't make his high school basketball team when he was a freshman, they'd say, you are not a basketball player, you are done. based on a static decision then. And he would not be allowed to, the state would have to decide to improve him. He would not be allowed to improve himself, and he never does. And so the long run is dynamic. Do you allow dynamic to happen? Information costs time, money, effort. Going back to macro level. I have tanks. A lot of times I use military analogies, military situations. One, I'm ex-military, but the other reason is the military is one of the things the government is entrusted to do. The government's kind of stuck doing the military, and it's one of those ones where when the government fails, they suffer an expense for it. They suffer a lot for failure. So when the government has an epic fail, the government is failed. The government gets punished for it. Mac level. Okay, information costs time, money, and effort. Now what that means is to know something, I have to either spend time learning it, money learning, or keep in mind, money could be money learning, getting books and stuff like that. It could also be I've hired somebody who knows how it works, and effort. Now effort, time, and money are related, but effort's kind of like the whole nose to grindstone, which does go in with time, but time is money, stuff like that. I always have effort there, and the books have had it, and so I keep it because I like it as that third one, representing, does the person have the will, the drive to achieve it? Now, these are two tanks there. The top one was the T-34. The bottom was the Panzer IIIH. The T-34 had the Panzer IIIH outclassed in armor, and the Panzer IIIH had a low-velocity 50-millimeter gun. Low velocity means the round comes out slow. The T-34 had a 76-millimeter high-velocity gun. The T-34 was a faster tank. The T-34 was better on cross-country. The big things the Panzer III had over the T-34, which is a good thing, was it had a better targeting mechanism, and they had radios. T-34s don't get radios until later. That way Panzer IIIHs can coordinate. And so, in other words, a Panzer IIIH could hit a T-34 in the first shot. A T-34 might take 3 or 4 shots to hit you. Of course, the thing is, a Panzer IIIH shooting a T-34, most times you're going to hear a ding noise as its round bounces off the T-34. The T-34 is very unimpressed. If a T-34 76-millimeter round hit a Panzer IIIH, it's going through the sucker. In other words, to be simple, you dead, honey. Okay, how did Panzer IIIHs kill more T-34s than T-34s killed Panzer IIIHs? That is info. That is people knowing how to do things, people learning and the such. What kind of decision making. That goes back to government decisions here. And then I meant this stuff here is like, what kind of tactics do you have? How are you going to use your tanks? How are you going to resupply them? How are you going to repair them? What is the value of human life? When we talked about the Soviets did not care. And so the Soviets fed their men in waves to take a position. The Americans, the British, the Germans, they try to say, okay, what's a different way of fighting this to get my objective without having a lot of bodies? Because go back to American history, we had our Civil War. After our Civil War, it became the general mantra of the United States. Let's not waste that many human lives in frontal attacks and stupid acts and stuff like that. If we can, let's use lots of artillery. Let's use lots of weapons. Let's use lots of bullets. Because that keeps us from using lots of lives. That became the general American framework. And so that's what? That's information. That's acquiring it. Now, the economic method. The economic method is I said, I always say barring communism. Communism is a very popular system, especially people your age. They all, work, it'd be that. It was a system that cares for people and loves people, stuff like that. which always amazes me. But then people don't tell what has happened with communism. So say except for communism, because a lot of times it dies. But here's an example of it. This is the economic method. Now, the economic method follows the scientific method. We try to figure out what works. We prove things, we disprove things, we figure things out. Now, observation. Now, this is a photograph from space at night over the Korean Peninsula. Now, if you look at the coast, you can see the whole Korean Peninsula there. It's just the fact that the reason you can see it semi-outlined is when they put an outline. The other reason is when you get an interesting night shot. The ocean actually is reflective. So the ocean looks like it shimmers a little bit. But, we're looking at this, we're observing. South Korea is rich. That glowy area, that big glowing red dot, that's Seoul. South Korea. South Korea is rich. They're living well. North Korea is poor. South Korea is a market economy. North Korea is a communist state. Now, these are ethnographically the same people. South Koreans and North Koreans are Koreans. They have the same, in fact, until the end of the Second World War, when the Soviets occupied Northern Korea and the Americans got the southern part, they were the same people, the same history, same culture, same everything. But we're looking at this place at night and saying what? One country has goodies. Another country has no goodies. In fact, observation, you observe that the average South Korean male is about 5'7", the average North Korean male is about 5'2". That's a 5-inch difference. From the people, ethnic, in other words, we're not comparing, Zulus to pygmies. We are comparing Koreans and Koreans, the same ethnographic people. In South Korea, they're taller. They're richer. They have more goodies. Okay, we have observed an actual thing that exists. We know the economy of two nations. We make a theory. We conject that communism makes you poorer, and that markets or anything that's not communism is going to tend to make you richer. So we've developed a theory. Now, we've developed a theory. You have to engage in more observation to prove if the theory's right and when, because sometimes, remember, macro conditions may be different in different places. Sometimes it may work someplace and may not work in other ones. Gun control has been highly effective in Japan. It has been highly ineffective in the United States. Different population. And that is very important. So we develop a theory, we do more observations, see what it is. Okay, this one, you had me in micro, we've seen this line a lot. This is a Venezuelan food line. In other words, the Venezuelans adopted basically a type of communism. I say a type, basically communism. And they got a food line. Venezuela didn't have, if you were in 1990s Venezuela, you did not have food lines. You go to the store, you get the things, and you might wait, there might be 2 or 3 people in front of you. There you go. Now you have food lines. Why? There is no food, or very less food. The average, weight and probably height of the Venezuelan population has dropped about 30 or 40 pounds, very intensely during the teens. But, since, and I'd lay odds if they were doing height measurements, you'd probably find the average Venezuelan is shorter than they were 3 decades ago. And so, that's an impact on which we do more observation. We find out Venezuela is poor, Cuba is poor, the Eastern Bloc, every place that gets, basically, some places will call themselves socialist, but they're really communist because the government has all the power. Let's avoid giving socialism. And I'm not saying I like socialism. You can make socialism function. You just have to be very, very careful. I'm not saying it'll work. I'm just pointing out, that efficiency, trade-off. Yeah, actually, when the population was starving, he actually called it the Maduro diet, the former leader of Venezuela, who told Trump, now, I don't know why people tell Trump these things, come and get me, and Trump went and got him. you throws a check. I'm not being pro-Trump or anti-Trump. I'm saying it's knowing the people you're dealing with. Trump's the kind of man. Hey, you go and say, I'm gonna stick it to you. He'll say challenge accepted. So Maduro's basically seeing U.S. prison. Basically, one of the ways the Venezuelan government got money was helping to facilitate the sales of drugs in the United States and other things. And so, but Venezuela says, but he called it when the population lost 25 pounds in 1 year on average. He said, but Venezuelans are getting tougher. They have the Maduro diet. It's like, dude, you are a chunky monkey. He was a very chunky monkey. He's chunkier than I am. I mean, he's a chunky monkey. You are not one to tell people they're doing better having a diet when you sit there and you look like you at the dessert table 2-3 times. I'm just saying. But did he actually call that himself like something big? It's like, you're an idiot. And so that impact. Now, the economic method, scientific method, leads to the question to be very careful. There are lies, don lies, and statistics. In terms of, and I point out a sense of a lot of times people are going to lie to you. They're not going to tell you a full lie. They will tell you a half truth. They will give you some information. They will not give you all information because they will expect you to leap and jump to the wrong conclusion. That you will go the wrong way and say, "Oh, it is this," and that's what you'll do. So you'll leap to the wrong conclusion. You'll leap to the wrong set, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to ever be jumping to the wrong conclusion. And people do that. Notice they make that mistake. Why do they make that mistake? Because they have all the truth. Why don't I have Ulysses Grant here? The term lies, don lies, statistics. When people were talking about Grant during the Civil War, the American Civil War, and afterwards, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who respected and thought of Grant as a friend when his whole career, Sherman's career collapsed. Grant pulled him up from the dust, dusted him off, and gave him a crack at it. And he did it. And people talk about how Grant being a butcher. Sherman got upset and he said there are lies, don lies, and statistics. Now, what they did when they said Grant being a butcher, I'm using this one first because you hear this one constantly. Oh, there was Cold Harbor. Several thousand men just died. Grant just charged me. Grant was a butcher. Okay, now, Cold Harbor. Let's explain Cold Harbor. Yes, there was a fog over the ground. Confederate trenches were several hundred yards away. And the thought was a sudden bull rush could potentially take the Confederate trenches. And it wasn't 6,000 dead men like we hear constantly. It was 6,000 people injured. And it failed and he called it off. Now let's take another charge. Now keep in mind, Cold Harbor happened under fog. If I'm charging you entrenchments, fog works better for me because you can't see me to shoot me. Because you're in a trench, you're going to get a lot of shots. I'm running across terrain. Having to be able to see me makes an advantage for me. The high point of the Confederacy is often called Pickett's Charge. Pickett's Charge involves sending 15,000 men across a mile and a half of open terrain against dug-in opposition who's on a ridgeline. In other words, they see you coming. And they butcher you. In other words, Pickett's Charge also went an hour and changed and cost far more lives than Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor is called a tragedy. Pickett's Charge it was the high point of the Confederacy. It was stupid. But when people compare Grant, they don't compare Grant. They said he had all these dead men under him. Look at these casualty lists. It's a war. During a war, people are going to die. The reason I point out is Grant had a lower casualty rate as a percent of his army than every commander of the Army of the Potomac, except for the first one. Because first Bull Run was a very, scat affair, units broke easy, stuff like that. I'm just pointing out. So he had a lower count. In other words, compared to other words, people comparing Grant saying losses to where there's this mythical state where how many people died? None. We just have this great victory and nobody dies. It'd just be a big zero for deaths. That's what they compare it to. When the reality is if not this commander, what's the other commander you get? Now I know I look like I'm looking down. It's because I'm looking at the PowerPoint and the camera is right. See my fingers blocking. That's above, so that's why I see it at the top of my head. I'm not trying to scare you with my bald spot. But and so Grant did that. They compared him to no one suffering losses. When you compare him to other commanders in their performance, he did much better. In fact, he's the only general to receive the surrender of 3 armies in the American Civil War. No other general received the surrender of that many men, or in 3 different armies. That's amazing. A great example here, the CIA in Trabant. Trabant was an East German people's car. And so what occurred with this East German people's car, and it's East German garbage car, the Germans, the East German Communist government created Trabant. And people who, the communists themselves and people who believed in communist academics said, like, oh, the Trabant is a great car. It's a people's car. It's a fantastic car. And so they said the Trabant, they taught this in Harvard and Yale and Princeton, usually among people who are not economists, thank God. But they go into, making assessments that a Trabant was equal to a Cadillac. Now, let me explain some different things, these things. Now, they did the equivalence thing. It's the same thing. It's basically the same thing. In fact, we talk about data measuring growth. We're talking about people saying this is the same thing. It is not the same thing. When my father retired, he got a Cadillac. I mean, he got a Cadillac. It had the leather seats. It had the seats that heated and cooled. That thing had a speedometer, went to 360. This baby was beautiful. When you turned on the heat came on. When you turned on the cold came on. This thing was a thing of beauty. It was a fantastically wonderful car. My brother took it out one night, late. And since my father retired, my brother was in his 40s. He goes, John, I took out Dad's car. He goes, it was 3 in the morning. We went on the highway. He goes, Dad's car can do 180. Because my father was on a trip. And he goes, it didn't even vibrate. You didn't even feel anything. You didn't even hear the wind. It was beautiful. He goes, it's so good Dad didn't get this car when I was a teenager. Because I would have gone all the way up to 360, driven into a concrete barrier, and Dad would have killed me. That's a Cadillac. Okay, a Trabant. A Trabant had a two-cylinder, two-stroke. In other words, you had to make to a gas-oil mix engine. It had a heater did not work. It did not have AC. Didn't have a radio. In fact, it didn't even have a fuel gauge. You had to open up the hood, open up the gas tank, take out a measuring stick, and dip it in the tank to see how much fuel you had. And Trabant had trouble going up an incline. In fact, when President Reagan was first in office in early '81, he was getting a review, and they were telling him that East Germany was richer than West Germany. And he goes, excuse me? Because he'd been in East Germany and West Germany. East Germany built a wall to keep people from leaving communism. It was actually, if you tried to leave communism in East Germany, you were shot. Think about that. Now, I mean, I would love people. All the people who hate the United States and hate me and my people and stuff like that. And I mean, my people is my fellow Americans, all you dudes and dudettes. Everybody wants, my faith and stuff like that wiped out, the history of my country wiped out. Feel free to leave. I would not cry if the entire city of San Francisco left. If the 2/3 of Massachusetts that are nutty went and left to go live in Europe or something like that, or Iran or wherever, Palestine, I would not cry one tear. But they don't. Okay, so these kind of people said, communism's richer. It's far more successful. I mentioned before, I had a paper that was rejected when I was a grad student, but stating that communist economies were less efficient than they were, based on criteria. Because the acceptance thing was communist economies were 85, the Soviet Union was 85 to 90% of the American economy, maybe even larger. My estimates came out to about 50 to 55% of the American economy. When communism fell, it was discovered they were about a quarter of the American economy. In other words, I was too kind. Think about that. Okay, now so this is saying, he goes, how are you making East Germany richer than West Germany? And they said a Trabant was equal to a Cadillac. President Reagan walked the CIA representative through all the characteristics of a Trabant and all the characteristics of a Cadillac. In other words, he made the guy look like a buffoon. And keep in mind, when Reagan was president, the intellectual idea was, he's just a stupid actor. We are more brilliant than he is. But unlike them, he understood and knew why communism was going to fail. They lied because they believed in communism. It had to look better. Now, see, Reagan just walked through the whole thing, had him walk through and talk all the traits, made him look like an idiot in front of the cabinet meeting. Now, what I would have done? I would have said, and you were right, we're giving every person, the CIA is going to be given a Trabant. Since that's just as good as a Cadillac, we're going to buy 5,000 Trabants, and everyone in the CIA is going to have to drive a Trabant every day to and from work and for their personal activity when in the United States. And in the field, we might give you more flexibility unless you're just doing your station meeting. Otherwise, you'll be given a Trabant. How fast would the CIA have whined like stuck pigs? Well, you said it was equal to a Cadillac. We didn't mean that. That tells you right there. In a book for economics, a number of economists didn't want to get into socialist views. They didn't want to be on the wrong side of the culture debate. They said, single parents do as well as married parents. No, they don't. And they said, well, if they're earning the same money they do. Yes, but they don't on average. In other words, they said they act like being married or single was just this floating variable that meant nothing. Because they wanted an answer. So a lot of times, the easiest way to trick people is going to give them information that leads them to a conclusion you desire. Okay, the production's possibilities frontier. Now, this is a frontier, and they explain the book represents the edge, the mix of goods a country can produce if it is using all of its resources efficiently. Now, the PPF, as we use it right now, we're going to go growth later. As we right now, we are making no assessment. In other words, we're just saying, what is the mix of goods? And I'm going to be very craggy here with my line. I apologize. The country can make if we use all of our resources. Now, this gray line, which you can't see because my head's blocking, is the UK. Excuse me. That represents what the UK can make. Now, they have bread and textiles. I tend to pick things that people want. It's making no assessment about the country. The only big assessment it's making, they're assuming efficiency, which is a big assessment. We're just doing like an idea of so we just make the assumption, whatever system you're using, you would use resources efficiently. A very dangerous assumption, I know. Now, why is the frontier bent? That's easy. There are people who are good at one thing and they're not good at another. There are resources good for one activity, not good as another. There is land that is good for growing things. There's land that's not good for growing things. So all land is not. You see, if I had a straight line, which unfortunately this doesn't like to make a straight line, if I had a if I had a straight line, that's not straight either, but it'll do. Right? It'd be an exact trade-off. In other words, move one person here, they're gonna be just good at this as the other person. But not every person is good at everything. Not every good land is good for doing something. I grew up in New England. New England has lots of rocks. The soil in New England is not that good. And so if I'm growing food, I'm going to grow it in Mississippi or Iowa, someplace with good soil. New England's not where I'm going to grow. So, because New England doesn't give you the same yield as these other places. It doesn't give you the same yield of soil as these other places. And so you wouldn't use New England much because all the soils are the same. All the people aren't as good at farming. And not all good farmers the same thing. I have a former student, him and his brother, own. They basically, when they were in high school, they bought some land. They started doing, basically what's called cane fruit. Cranberry, raspberry, stuff like that. Well, not cranberry, raspberries and blueberries, stuff like that. They grow them and they sell them in the grocery stores. Or the firms that sell the grocery stores, packaging firms. And they slowly over time bought more and more land. They buy land that's good for that cane fruit. They're very good at growing cane fruit. They would not know how to grow wheat because they don't grow wheat. So the productivity of wheat would be a lot lower than cane fruit because they know how to grow cane fruit. So that's why it's not a straight line. It's not a straight line because everybody is not good at everything. Let me give her that ugly straight line. I can give her that too. And so it represents a trade-off. We are assuming efficiency to be simple. It's a dangerous assumption, I know, although the sixth item does catch that back again. Now, this is I'm using the UK here. The little one way in the bottom, that's Cuba. That's just comparing Cuba's edge to the UK's. Cuba's dirt poor. The UK is rich, relatively speaking. I mean, granted, the UK is poorer than Mississippi, our poorest state, on a per-person basis, but it is still vastly richer than Cuba, most of these European countries and stuff like that, the Middle East and stuff like that. Not being cruel, it's what it is. Okay, now the UK, the question eventually becomes, okay, I'm being efficient. I won't do C. No one does C because we can get to B. Because B gives more both than C, and what's like more bread, more textiles. I'm not going to do C, I'm going to do B because with the same resources, I can have more goodies. Remember, whatever system we do, we're assuming efficiency. No one would make an inefficient decision when I have an obviously better decision. So whatever we do, we're going to assume to be efficient. But then quickly comes the question of, well, B is nice, but I want to get to A. How do I get to A? How do I move out that whole frontier? How do I expand what we have so we can have more? I apologize. I'm going to have to stand a little bit because I need to get the blood flowing in my legs and such. I'm not being, keep in mind, I'm doing this because, roughly speaking, when I sit for so long, I'm old, things build up in my legs, stuff like that. And so those of you who have me know, I'm a pacer, I'm a walker. I like to move, I like activity, I like to go back and forth, so everything starts to settle in my legs. And so that's, and I apologize for that. So occasionally I do this when recording lectures. It's not to drive you batty. It's because I need to move and stuff like that. Heck, I admit, if I could record this at school using the boards, I would, because those are cool boards. I'm not gonna lie. I love the active classrooms there. That's fantastic. This is so cool. Okay, going back to, so how do I get from B to A? I am Cuba. I am here. How do I get to C and then to B and then to A? How do I do that? These becomes situations. Now, so I may have, we're gonna have land issues, which we talked about. Labor, resource differences. They account for the curvature of the PPF. We're gonna be using everything efficiently, but we can't use everything doesn't do everything equally well. That's all that means. Okay, now the PPF is often used, and I've done the PPF so far as a trade-off between butter, food, and textiles, or bread and textiles. Because why? We want food, we want textiles, we want clothing, we want food. Those are two things we want. Too often because this goes back to Vietnam War, people said, we have a trade-off. We should have guns or butter. And this again is a leading argument. In some cases intentionally, and when it was being done, it was intentional. Because usually it's done this way. Anytime someone does this way, we can have one B-2 bomber or 10,000 houses for the poor. Okay, that is a leading argument. Because strictly speaking, we want housing for people. What does military hardware do besides be expensive? In other words, we have a good that people actually want that makes them better off. Boom, housing. And we have military hardware that doesn't make you better off. So it's a leading argument. It's designed in a certain way to where there's only one answer. And that's the reason why, because military hardware is non-productive. It doesn't increase our standard of living. Because people say, well, no, you're building out stuff for the military. You have to move the resources from someplace else to the military. There's something, all economists, well, it's you can still economists outside the window, but, Keynesians, neo-Keynesians, new classics, stuff like that, they all agree you have to divert resources. You have to shift resources in order to achieve this. So I'm moving resources. Like I said, I'm not being, cruel or anything here. So that's a leading argument because of the fact of the way it is set. People military hardware does nothing for us, but consumer goods do. So we want consumer goods. Which means, okay, are there economic rationale for guns? Yes. Why do you have guns? I always go over these economic rationales because we can have an economic rationale for guns. I mean, it's laid out there. There's no economic rationale for it. And keep in mind, we're talking military spending, governmental military spending. We're not talking about you owning an AR-15 or a 45 or a 22 or something like that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about military spending. Why do I have guns? Now, if you look at this map here, that is the map of Napoleonic Europe. That is one reason to have guns. Imperialistic conquest. I'm going to invade another country. I'm going to take what is theirs and make it mine so my people live better. So, for example, the conquest, you know what the Spanish spent for the conquest of the Incan Empire? About 160 guys. 160 guys conquered an empire of almost 20 million. Why? Because the Incans had barely entered the Bronze. In fact, they weren't even really in the Bronze Age. They had some metalworking, but we're talking people fought with sticks in a loincloth. In other words, they were fighting in a Speedo. And you're the Spanish. You're going to fight with 20 or 30,000 Incan troops. They're coming at you with sticks. Okay, shopping sticks. You're wearing metal breastplate, a metal helmet, the big conquistador helmet. You've got thigh guards and shin guards. You've got a metal sword. You got, guards on your forearms, your upper arms. What's that stick gonna do to you? Boink, 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 nothing. What are you gonna do? Sloosh, sloosh, sloosh. So for spending a few hundred, sending, not losing, not sacrificing those guys, just sending a few hundred guys there, you conquer an empire of tens of, I said between 10 and 20 million people, and you gained oodles and oodles of gold and silver. That made your country and people richer. The Napoleonic period, I use Napoleon here because it's a great one. France, under the height of the empire. So if you look at that red area, is the French Empire. Now it's bigger than France as we know it. They added on those regions. So for the person of France proper, under the empire's height, the taxes were immensely lower. In other words, the France proper had low taxes. The French New Addens in Dalmatia, Italy, Holland, the coast of Germany, stuff like that, they had higher taxes than France proper. The subject states, all those ones in orange, paid France tribute. In fact, some of the ones in blue, the Prussian stuff like that, they had to pay the French war reparations, massive war reparations, to pay to support the French government. France, it'd be like the United States today. The United States today. Imagine us having the current government spending we're having, but with our tax burden being 1/3 what it is. And not only that, not only is your tax burden 1/3 of this, you're not borrowing any money because why? All the money you're getting shipped from other countries is allowing your government to spend that. So in other words, the French had widows of soldiers who were receiving good pensions because why? The places we had invaded were paying the money so the widow and the children could receive a pension. So imperialistic conquest, that can make your nation better off. I'm not advocating, I'm just pointing out, because theoretically as a government, I exist to make my people better off. I conquer a resource-rich people. It supplies more goods, more services to my population, more tax revenue. My population now lives better. So in other words, that the empire existed for the betterment of France. And the French population benefited. That was what? Imperialistic conquest. You're doing that to making that. That's one reason for guns. I'm going to invade my neighbors. Because why? That'll make me better off. That's what I'm doing it for. In fact, heck, if the United States were going to invade somebody, I'd invade Canada. It's a nation full of pacifists. Great people invade. Lots of resources, a bunch of pacifists. When you go in, they do their giant march. 500,000 people get in the streets of Toronto saying, Yankee, go home. Then you have A-10s fly over and 30mm cannons go off, and boom, you got rid of all the protesters. Why? Because they thought passive resistance would work. Passive resistance only works when the person you're being passive resistant against cares. That's why when people say Trump is a fascist, oh, come off it. If Trump is a fascist, the four hags on the View wouldn't be there; they'd be dead. If Trump were a fascist, when you have all those people protesting ICE, they'd be dead or they'd be beaten. You know that person who drives into an ICE van saying, you're a fascist. It's like, no, because why? The ICE guys would come up, they'd bust up her car, turn it over, set it on fire, they'd break both her legs. When her wife comes along and says, tries to hang him, they break her jaw and legs too, and they'd say, hey, welcome to the thing. When the media reports it, they go and report it. The U.S. JAC troops go in and they beat them up too, and they pull their license. I'm not being cruel. I'm pointing out that's fascism. That's a totalitarian regime. If you like to call Trump this or that, something, people may engage in heavy social. Keep in mind, fascism is another form of socialism, or mild fascism, use the term loosely, is another form of managed economy. Oops, I was going to the next slide. Okay. The other thing for military is defense. Have enough military to where your neighbors don't attack you. For centuries, and I do mean centuries, everybody went through Switzerland to invade other people because it had some broad, easy routes to go through Switzerland. In other words, you could march an army right down some of those long valleys. They were great. They were open. You can do that. And they did it regularly. In fact, if you went back to the slide and looked at Switzerland, Napoleonic Empire, it lost some of its territory and stuff like that because of the war. And Napoleon invaded and conquered stuff like that. The Swiss said, okay, that's enough. We're going to build enough military strength to where invading us is not worth the effort. We're going to be strong enough to where if you attack us, you might win, but you'll pay so much it's not worth it. So in defense, attack is saying building enough to conquer somebody to make my country rich at their expense. Defense is building enough so nobody bothers you. So whereas attacking says you may have to build a lot of stuff. Defense, depending where I am, I don't need to build much. And so, that becomes you build enough so no one attacks you. The United States. The United States was, before the First World War, we were the world's largest economy, easily. And I do mean easily. In fact, one of the reasons we got the Washington Naval Agreement was the United States told the British and Japanese, this is what the world's going to be. We're going to have equality of fleet sizes, and you guys will save money, and I'll save money. But if you don't go for this, we're going to build the 50 battleship Navy, which is what the United States was looking at doing, and we'll just grind you both into powder because you can't spend the military. That's defense. I point out in the sense of, that. So how much do I need for defense? And one of the ways the United States made us to have less defense is because we told them we'll have to build to match you, and you can't match us. So let's just make a deal. Enough so someone doesn't bother you. Well, why did I mention this? Well, if the United States during the 30s, I apologize. We had the Great Depression, and a lot of people are like, oh, it was so tough. The United States spent less than 1% of our economy on the military. Yeah, I know. Say, why don't you type in notes? It's because every time I try to, it goes schizo. So that's why I don't type notes. If you're wondering, you have notes in there. It's so funny, right? I'm moving my hand one way, but I see it the other way because of so I apologize. There, get rid of it. Okay. No, so 1940 was during the 30s, the United States spent less than 1% of our economy was spent in defense. Less than 1%. We're an immense nation, so a lot of countries looked and said, you're weak, you're soft. In fact, Americans would have tank maneuvers in which we basically, you go to a bunch of guys, say, go get your cars. We're going to put a sign on it that says tank, and we'll treat your car like it's a tank. We did that kind of stuff because we didn't spend the money on the military. I'm not lying. I'm pointing out the deficiency of what we were doing. If the United States had, during the 30s, spent 3% of our economy on defense. In other words, we were spending less than 1%. Had we spent 3% of our economy, to give you an idea of how big the American economy was, from say 33 to, it wouldn't be until 41 we went beyond this 3% barrier. Just to give you an idea of how chintzy we were. If we're spending 3% of our economy, to give you an idea, we spend about 4 or 5% now. Just to give you an idea of the item. We spend over 3% now. We actually spend a little over 3% now. Yeah, we spend about 3% of our economy now on defense. Just to give you an idea. And we have the world's largest defense budget because we're so huge. We're so huge then. Had we done that, the U.S. Navy would have been so huge. Just our Navy would have been so large that theoretically, at Pearl Harbor, if the Japanese sank every single ship in the harbor, the battleships, the destroyers, the transport submarines, everything, if they sank everything, our Navy was so large, we would have had a fleet in San Diego that would be larger than the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was just the second Pacific Fleet based in San Diego because we'd be able to fit all the ships in Pearl Harbor. Would be larger than the Imperial Japanese Navy. And not only that would be true, but there would have been the fleet in the Atlantic that would have been larger than the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese would have said, what? We can't go to war with them. Why? They're too big. In other words, we wouldn't have been involved in the Second World War because the Japanese never would have attacked. You would never had Hitler and Parliament going in the Reichstag going, oh, Roosevelt is saying, do not attack these nations. And basically he made a big joke saying, when you spend this much on your economy on defense, no one's going to listen to you. And so the United States looked weak. We were militarily weak, and we looked what's called morale weak. In other words, willpower weak. They said, America's not going to fight for anything. They're a bunch of cowards and stuff like that. We'll just push them all over the place. I'm not being cruel. I'm pointing out in terms of the gap there, the difference there. You can't match that. And so the United States looked like an easy target. You couldn't, and that's because why? We didn't spend it. So spending enough in defense so nobody bothers you. It's not, keep in mind, this is 3%. I could go back there, but if I'm attacking, I might be spending 9% of my economy on defense. In fact, one of the silliest things you have people say is, "Oh, the United States is engaging in world imperialism. World imperialism, America's doing imperialism." Oh, that is the biggest load of gooby boogie you'll ever hear. Okay, if the United States wanted to engage in world imperialism, it is let's see. It is October 1st, 1945. 500 B-29s appear over Moscow, flying at a height that the Soviet interceptors cannot reach them. One of the B-29s drops a 10-ton bomb, also known as a nuclear bomb. Moscow goes up in a 20-kiloton explosion. A day later, Leningrad is vaporized. The central marshalling point at Minsk is gone. The Soviet oil fields are hit with 2 more nuclear weapons. Actually, even use nuclear weapons. Again, 1,000 or 2,000 B-29s fly over the oil fields, and they just saturate, bomb it with napalm, leaving the oil fields in ruin, flaming ruin. I am not being cruel. I am pointing out the United States could have done that. We could have created the Pax Americana if we desired to, because we had long-range, high-level bombers. They did not. We had nuclear weapons. They did not. We could touch their homeland. They could not touch our homeland. That gives you all the advantage. I'm not being cruel. That is the reality of it. No, so when people say that, it's like, no. Because the United States wasn't engaged in defense. That's right. We're not engaged in attack or defense. Those are easily defined economic objectives. There is geopolitics. If you don't get involved and stop something, something really bad may happen. What's always called the Hitlerian complex. If people had stopped Hitler in 36, or 35, or 36 when he marched in Rhineland, everything would have been avoided. Which is, possible. This is like, I'm doing things not to conquer somebody, not even defend myself, and trying to prevent something bad from happening. The United States' current fighting against Iran is geopolitics. The Iranians are building an ICBM program and a nuclear program. They're not giving them up. We are doing this to do what? To stop it from going further. No, it's not strictly speaking defending. As long as you're strong enough to kill them, you're defended. And it's not really conquest, because we're not trying to conquer them and make us rich. That'd be useful, but we're not doing that. What is it? It's geopolitics. It's how are people going to react. And a lot of this, again, is based off using the Germans as an example. The Germans kept expanding, taking what the Nazis were taking what they were allowed to take, and they kept coming back for more. But that makes sense. A number of economists point out the Nazi regime, in true socialist fashion, because remember, it is a national socialism, was spending and gobbling more than they produced and created. But they wanted their population to live well, so they had to go and take over other countries to pay for their voracious appetite. I'm pointing out the reality. Each time those areas were taken, Germany got a boost. I'm not being cruel. Like, I'm pointing out reality. To engage in geopolitics. And it's always difficult because geopolitics is how will, people react or counter-react. Like, I can argue, for Germany, I can argue a counterpoint saying, hey, the Western Allies could have hung Poland, here's Poland, out to dry. And it was geopolitics. It was having given up the Austrians, the Czechs, stuff like that, particularly the Czechs, the Slovaks. Let Hitler have Poland, because what does he want to do? He wants to go east. It's after Poland, he's going to want to attack the Soviet. He's going to want to attack the Soviets. Let him go that way. Tell him to have fun. Not our problem. In fact, if that happens and the Nazis are fighting the Soviets in 1940, if you're the British and the French, It's cool. Neither going to cause you problems because why? They're killing each other. You're safer. That's another big trait for geopolitics. Here's a great example of geopolitics. Costa Rica. This one is just beautiful. Costa Rica is such a fantastic example of geopolitics, of knowing mindset. In the 80s, in 79, Nicaragua became a communist country. And so Nicaragua engaged in funding communist revolutionaries in all the surrounding countries. At least they pay for guerrillas to operate, try to overthrow the country because the communist fervor. Well, Costa Rica has no army, so they're very vulnerable. They have a large police force, that's just a police force, a national police force. That's it. They have no army. So the Costa Rican president told the Nicaraguans, if just one stupid commie guerrilla comes into our country, I am flying to Washington, D.C. I'm going to sign a defense pact with the Americans, alliance. I'm going to ask the Americans to come in and kick your butts out of my country. I will invoke that alliance 2 days after I sign it, and you'll all be dead because the Americans will kill you. Because you have violated the alliance I have with the Americans. And that's great geopolitics. In other words, they didn't want to, Costa Rica didn't want to spend enough money to defend because that leads to, a lot of times, a number of countries, instability, and it's expensive. Remember, those guns don't do much for you. They're preventative. So they said, I will use geopolitics. I will use the action-reaction principle. I will scare off Nicaragua saying, if you go and try to bother me and cause me 1 ounce of trouble, I'm going to go talk to the Americans. And the Americans will sign an alliance with me, and then I'll invoke that alliance, have the Americans kick your butt all over the place. And Nicaragua, like trying to look like they're big by pushing the Americans around, but they want to give the Americans a callous belly. I know these other things are just examples. Everybody worry about Russia today. That's geopolitics. In the 19th century, Bismarck, ruler of Germany, formed a number of alliances to keep stability. In other words, that was geopolitics. He did not want any more wars. After Germany was unified, he was willing to sacrifice everything, including German interest, to have perpetual peace. And he created the alliances to introduce stability. Because nothing would happen unless the Germans would basically say, we don't want war. Which is something Bismarck, was very, successful at implementing. The U.S. commitment to NATO and stuff like that. In fact, NATO is endangered because Americans would deny the use of NATO bases, U.S. bases, and allies for operations against Iran. The United States gets very miffed about it, and we're saying we may pull out of NATO. The European countries, except for Poland, do not maintain a large military forces because the Americans will defend them. So again, if someone else wants to defend you, why spend the money? And they have not. And the Americans like, well, you weren't friendly. That's geopolitics. I have to then let the Americans use air bases and military bases, even if I don't like it at times, because I have this treaty with them. But a treaty must work to the advantage of both countries. That becomes a difficulty. Okay, let's go for this is early simple growth. Again, I want to go over guns and butter before we did the whole shift in the PPF because I wanted to understand that debate, the leading argument, and there can be economic rationales for guns. I want you to understand that and why it's different from butter, so you can understand the leading arguments. Because consumer goods is easy to argue for. Yeah, it's cool. We can live better. Guns, it's weird. And so when you say guns, it's, folks say, well, they're assuming you know. No. In other words, they're leaving it empty that way because I remember the arguments when I was young and they were repeated in textbooks constantly. Just like you have this or this many houses or something like that. You have to have what's the economic rationale for guns? Or it's society, they want that thing. Kind of weak. Now we get to the main thing. How do we move out that frontier we talked about earlier? Now, C going to B is just being efficient. B going to A, that is more work. That is, how do I produce more? How do I have more? Now, again, we're being simple here. We're going to be assuming efficiency. We see whatever you do, you're going to be efficient. But these are things that move out, that magnify the frontier, that make us better off. Now, this one is easy. Technology. Technology is the ace, the wild card. I love technology. Technology is fantastic. This is what the Japanese, when I talk to the Japanese, interacting with the Japanese when you had the Meiji Restoration. Before the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese just ignored the technology. After Meiji Restoration, the Japanese said, we need technology. Okay, why that? That is the iron plow. In both Europe and China, there are rich lands that in ancient times into the early Middle Ages, the land was not used for farming because in China's case, it didn't flood, so it didn't get soft. In Europe's case, it was just thick, so they couldn't break the land. They do a lot of grazing on it. They grazed the animals there. When you have the invention of the iron plow, you now have a plow that can break thick, luscious soil that is high productivity. We couldn't use this soil before because we're using wooden plows, and wooden plows would not break the soil. In fact, one of the reasons civilization starts up in all those river valley things, you've seen those, the ancient Western Civ courses, they'd be like, oh, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus River Valley, the Ganges, the Yellow River, and stuff like that. Why you tend to see, I always forget the other Chinese major river. Now it's going to be thinking, when you see all these, well, those rivers would flood. I'm looking at major Chinese rivers. But those rivers would flood regularly, so when they flood, you'd have new dirt that would be very soft, very pliable. In other words, I could go there, plow that dirt up. Okay, the Yangtze and the Yellow. That's my mistake. I always thought the Yangtze and the Yellow. I might make the same. My bad. Going back to that. The iron plow allows to break up thick, heavy soil. And all of a sudden, in Europe and China, you could double and triple food output, particularly in Europe, because you can now plow very rich soil that you couldn't plow before because the wooden plows would not break up the soil. And so new technology. That's a simple example of new technology. That's new technology. When you find a new and better way of doing things, new technology that magnifies productivity. Now, granted, we make the assumption you use it efficiently. And not all new technology is actually efficient. But that's all you should know is, again, we assumed efficiency. It's always shifting out the frontier if we use it. Technology is an ace because we only use technology if it is efficient, if it makes us better off. Granted, with the government, people have the government and people use bad technology, but that's the fault of government. We've assumed efficiency. Our government will not use an efficient technology. Capital, plant, machinery, equipment. That long thing, that is an irrigation system. In fact, that is an improved, cheap portable irrigation system which you hook up to a central plug when the water rotates around and when the water blows through, right? If I remember it correctly, when the water goes through, the pressure of the water even causes the wheels to turn. And so the thing goes the giant circle and waters the crops. That's irrigation technology. Not just technology, but also the capital coming to do it. When you go back to, I'm using Middle Ages now. Spain used to have irrigation in many of the Spanish lands because it was what? Spain had dry lands. We had to build irrigation ditches to get water into the dry lands so we could grow crops. That is capital equipment. So when you buy these things, that increases your productivity. So I'm doing things already known. I was the Japanese. I'm catching up. I'm getting technology from other people. I'm getting capital from other people so I can produce more, so I can create more. Human capital. Do we have people who know how to use the devices? This is very important. That is a packet. That's a 2.5-ton truck. The United States in the Second World War, we supplied, when you get, by the time it gets 1983, we're supplying over 90% in many cases of this trucks used in the Soviet Union were built in the United States or the British. British supplied some of them too, not as many. So we basically, when the Soviet divisions had any mechanization, motorized, we're the one who gave the trucks. So in other words, we had the great Soviet offenses in 43 and 44 and 45. It's because they had U.S. trucks who were delivering all the, beans, bullets, gasoline, stuff like that. In fact, we supplied over half of the aviation fuel. I point out this is all logistics. Do the people know how to use it? Very early in the war, the Soviets complained about American trucks saying they broke down. The United States sent motor pool people to go investigate. The Soviets were insulted because these guys were all, NCOs. They were not officers. And the Americans are like, well, yeah, but NCOs enlisted know how to repair trucks. Soviet NCOs enlisted did not know how to repair trucks. And that is very important. They had no idea of how to do these things, whereas the other ones did. And so Soviet American trucks given the Soviets had a massive breakdown rate. At least speaking, in many cases, the things the Soviet drivers could do was put gas in and drive. Releasing, draining air brakes, they knew nothing about that. Changing tires, nope. Changing belts, nope. And keep in mind, these are very simple trucks. It's not like modern automobiles where you have to hook electronics, know what they're doing. The average American knew how to fix a truck. And that is very important. So you have the human capital. Muhammad Ali of Egypt. Yes, his name was Muhammad Ali. No relation to the boxer. He was actually of Albanian descent. He was ruler of Egypt. He says, I don't get this. He goes, Egypt. And he points out, he goes, where's very silly in Egypt? We grow the best cotton in the world. So Egypt's like, man, we grow the best cotton in the world. Well, what is that this used for racing? Oh, that's depressing. No. Give me. We grow the best cotton in the world, right? We export that to the British, and then the British sell us finished cotton products. He said, what if we made our own? What if we bought plant and equipment? We build a factory and we make our own cotton products. We'll have it cheaper than the British because why? We don't need to have the bulk cotton imported to Egypt. It's right here. We're harvesting it off the crop, off the Nile Delta and stuff like that. We got cotton right here. And so he bought lots of plant and equipment. Okay, the difficult thing is his workers, Egypt of 1820, 1830, had about as much understanding of engineering, even a little bit less so than Egypt of Ramesses II. And it was sure they could buy sophisticated stuff. They didn't know how to make it or produce it. And so they bought a lot of machinery. A number of Egyptian workers attacked the machinery when the machinery moved on its own, believing it was inhabited with evil spirits. Which is horrible. They didn't know how to maintain the equipment. They didn't know how to do it. And they didn't just, the government didn't think about the fact of I'm using equipment which requires oil in a very dry, sandy environment. And a hot dry. And so the sand got into a lot of the equipment and caused what? Damage. The population didn't know how to do maintenance. Maintenance is a killer in many places. That's human capital. So do you have that? And last example goes back with the trucks and stuff like that. Is in the Battle of Kursk, one Tiger commander, his Tiger destroyed 51, actually 49 T-34s. Two of the other kills actually goes back to the commander when at night while walking, he came upon a Soviet roadblock. He took two satchel charges, basically high explosive charges, and threw one in one tank and one in the other tank, and walked away, and they detonated, exploded, and destroyed the tank. So they weren't killed by T-34s. All of them were killed by what? Human capital. Do I know what I'm doing? Can I do it better? I'm not being cruel. Just like when Tigers fought Americans did not fight Tigers directly because why? A Sherman cannot beat a Tiger. To borrow what one British officer said when he was fighting a Tiger once, he goes, I came upon him. I shot at him. It bounced off. We maneuvered. I came upon him again. I shot him twice. They both bounced off. He shot at me. It did not bounce off. Well, that's not the Tigers round's not going to bounce off you. Americans would tend to do what? We would pull back and call in for air artillery support, both of which were very effective against Tigers. What am I doing? I'm using resources. But to do that, I need to know people who know how to do those things, those multiple items required. That's human capital. If you have the first three, if you've got those first three, you've got capital, technology, human capital, you will be rich. Singapore, it's a picture of Singapore. Singapore is wealthy. Singapore is one of the wealthiest places on earth. They're an island. They have to even import their water. In other words, everything they use and generate, they import and make it richer and worth more. That is incredible. So if you have the first three, you will be efficient. You'll be rich, I should say. We are assuming if you'll be rich. The next one is a nice to have. Some economists trash it again because they don't want to touch culture. It's horrible when you want to touch culture because people say bad things about me. They'll call me names. It's like, no, it says, let's do the next one. Resources. Iron, coal, oil, natural gas, great farmland, stuff like that. If you have those, that is great. It is easier for your country to become rich. Because why? I have the resources right there. We can dig them up. It gives me an advantage. I can produce, build, and generate. I talk about shipping them in and stuff like that. When you have resources, it's easier for your country to become rich. A number of comments say, well, it may make nations lazy. Because look what people have done. It's like, yes, but a lot of times it's made people lazy. It's because the government is the one who's claimed the riches. There's in many countries, the government is the one that has the claim on all resources. You may make a deal with the government to extract them, but you don't own them. The government does. And so the government gets lots of tax revenue from these resources. So the government gets cheap, easy money. The government gets lazy. If your government tends to get lazy, your population will tend to follow suit. Again, I know I'm pacing. It's because my legs get stiff, and so I apologize. If you're wondering why he fades that little circle and comes and fades, it's because I have to move. I'm sitting too long. I tend to get, I'm old. I get, water drainage in my legs. I got to move around. So I apologize for that one. If I'm getting your ADHD going. But you have those, it's easy to get rich. You theoretically can get lazy. No, a lot of times it's the government that gets lazy because the government gets free money. Population, keep in mind, Texas had oil. Texas never got lazy because what do you actually have to do? In other words, people act like the resource is just sitting there, and oh look, I picked up 5 million barrels of oil off the ground and sold it and made money, and now I'm lazy. No. You actually have to build, dig, direct, build, construct. That's not going to make you lazy. But a lot of countries, what they did is they nationalized the stuff other people built. They nationalized other people's equipment, other people's items. So it's somebody came in and built the oil lines, the oil rigs, and the drilling stations, and the giant storage stuff. Somebody else built it. I just took it all. So it feels free because why? I did not make it. So resources. Okay, more people. This will expand your PPF, but it doesn't expand it that great. This is different from human capital. Human capital is people can do and know more, produce more. More people is just I'm adding more people to the country. It makes the pie look bigger, but remember when you add more people, everybody needs a slice. So adding more people, expands the PPF, but not the PPF per person. In other words, when you add more people, you're not expanding it per person. So that they can be a derogatory impact. The only time more people, and when I use the term any of these other items, when you get more of those other items, not only do they make themselves richer, they make everybody else connected richer. When you add more people, it's not making other people richer because they're competing with you. So they're driving up prices, reducing the amount of stuff like that from that impact. So, the only time you have that is when you had colonizations of empty places. The summer of the United States, of Canada, Australia, of Argentina, and stuff like that. You had vast open areas with no people there. What are we short on? People. So when I add more people, I can get more, more specialization, more economies of scale, stuff like that. There's my binding population, my binding condition way back when was a lack of people. That is not the problem. I may have a lack of hard capital, but not the lack of people. So no more people does not make a nation richer. The GDP gets larger, but the population tends to get smaller, tends to get poorer then. And our last one, acts of nature and stupid humans. Nature's easy. Forest, fire, floods, a giant asteroid slams on the planet. These are all acts of nature. Krakatoa goes up. In fact, at the end of the War of 1812 and the Napoleonic Wars, one of the volcanoes in Asia went up, blew up, and super volcano, blew up, and it gave us the year without a summer. Now it was cool, it was cold, you had snow further there. A lot of places still fed and took care of themselves. The United States had no mass starvation. Tight belts, but no mass starvation because why? We had a very effective market economy. So, we never, but again, that's nature. Then there's stupid humans. That's Kim Il-jung of North Korea. He's the ruler of North Korea. In North Korea, you have 5 allowable haircuts for men. I think it's like 10 for women. The government says what kind of hair people can cut, how it should look. His haircut is not one of the styles. He banned haircuts, not necessarily I like that haircut, but he, the ruler, can defy the rules. So in other words, if you're ruled by idiots, stupid government can do lots of damage. Go back to what Landis said. Government's like a girl with a little blonde curl. When she is good, she is very, very good. When she is bad, she is horrid. And that's the thing we have to remember. The sense of your government can get horrid. It can get devastatingly damaging. They're not being cruel. I am pointing that out. Okay, this is the end of that PowerPoint set. I know I have not posted them. I will soon. They'll be posted before the class starts. I'm just, getting the YouTube thing set up, I admit. It was good talking to you.